So this is going to be the section on early stage of synthesis. And we have a few learning objectives which I'll be outlining very briefly. The first one being distinguishing synthesis from summary. So that will involve understanding the fundamental differences between describing what studies have found and interpreting what those studies mean collectively. Secondly, we'll be looking at justifying a synthesis approach. So there's several different synthesis approaches, and we'll be covering those one by one today, or giving you an overview of what they are, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and where they're appropriate. Um, Following that, we'll also be looking to organize findings analytically. So moving again beyond chronological and alphabetical orderings to create meaningful analytical groupings that reveal patterns and relationships. Um, we will then look to develop early synthesis outputs and produce preliminary synthesis artifacts such as thematic maps, matrices, or narrative tables that can be used to structure your emerging interpretation. Moving on from that, our final objective or outcome is going to be demonstrating reflexivity. And this is basically the stage whereby you recognize and articulate how, through your own theoretical lens, what your assumptions are, what your positions are, and how they shape the synthesis process and outcomes. So a very brief recap of the systematic review journey. So you guys have already done the search, obviously. You have done your appraisal, whereby you assess study quality and relevance. You have done the extraction process, whereby you've collected the key data and variables. And that then leads us to the penultimate stage where we are now, and actually a very pivotal stage, which is the synthesis, which is basically, as I said before, taking all of that information that has been compiled previously and now actually going from the compiling stage into the synthesis stage, whereby you extract the meaning from it, you develop a coherent narrative, and that is essentially going to form the backbone of whatever writing comes afterwards. So again, just to notice how synthesis occupies the pivotal position between data collection and knowledge production. Everything before this point has basically been one long preparation, a lot of hard work. And now this is what is going to basically determine the quality of the writing that you produce based on how you choose to interpret the knowledge that you have gathered so far and extracted. So just to check in, um, we have a peer discussion prompt. So the question we're looking to answer is, what part of synthesis currently feels most unclear or intimidating to you? And obviously, this is going to be something that you discuss among yourselves, but it obviously, as moderators, we are here to help with the discussion process as well. And this is an opportunity to voice concerns and share uncertainties. Common concerns that come up include knowing when you've done enough analysis, managing contradictory findings, and maintaining objectivity while also interpreting creativity. So we'll address many of these anxieties throughout today's sessions and try to put your anxieties at ease and see how we can resolve them as they arise. So Joe, I don't know if we want to just um, take a brief moment right here to discuss this.
Yes, definitely. I think this would be really good. I don't know if you want to stop sharing and then for everyone to check in with that question, really. So the question was, what part of synthesis currently feels most unclear or intimidating to you?
I'm happy to share. I don't feel like I feel intimidated by it. I think it's the amount of time now. So it's having the time to go through the full paper extraction and then start writing up. So yeah, I don't think there's a fear there, but it's just the time commitment towards it.
Thanks, Kat.
I'll go because I'm partners with Kat. Same as Kat in terms of the time, but also probably a little bit of fear around having never done it before. So worrying that I'm gonna overcook it or not. I don't know. I don't know. I think I've just got to dive in and learn as I go.
I'll go next. I've come to that exact point where synthesis needs to be done. So I'm stuck. I don't know what to do next. So I'm glad this lesson is here today because my next steps is synthesis. So I've done all those that needs to be done and it's all sorted. So now is the next step. So that is where I am. So I'm looking forward to the class and learning because I don't know what to do next. Thank you.
I think I find it all quite intimidating at times. A lot of it is around actually having enough time to do this, and making sure I'm doing it correctly. But that's my stuff normally. Just trying to make sure I do everything properly. But I know working with somebody actually helps me to navigate that, so I'm quite happy about that part.
Yeah, I just like to echo the sentiments of what the previous speakers have said. Um, Synthesis, there's no two ways about it. It is very time consuming. There aren't any real shortcuts. Obviously, there are software out there that will greatly facilitate the synthesis process, and we will go through a few of those software today. But ultimately, yeah, it is a great labor, but it is a very productive endeavor. And I think what makes it, I don't want to say easier, but much more compatible with the rest of the entire review process is when you have a very clear focus of exactly what it is that you're trying to extract. And when you already are, if not already have a clear framework of how you're going to organize that data, then at least have I would say an evolving or workable framework in terms of how you're going to interpret all of the information and the data that you're going to be extracting. And once you know in what direction you're heading, that then makes the whole synthesis process a lot easier. But again, we will go more in depth into this in the course of this actual lesson today.
Based on what Antonio's just said about having a really clear framework, does anyone have any sort of thoughts on that or any questions on that before we push on?
Yeah, I was wondering because we've already have a clear framework on a question. So what do you mean by that, having a more clear framework? I don't know. I didn't understand that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So what I'm saying is that while the actual synthesis process itself can be very time consuming, once you already understand the once you have obviously by this time you would have had a very clear research question. Obviously, that is what you would have used to formulate your review process to actually select your articles, extract your articles, determine which ones would have made it to the final cut. That basically is going to be your guiding principle by how you actually synthesize data and determine what again fits where or how you actually begin to develop this coherent narrative. So it won't basically come down to the micro level in terms of determining every single aspect of of how you actually write it up, but it will basically be a guiding principle in terms of how you actually um, organize all of this ultimately, if that makes sense.
Any other thoughts, or shall we dive in?
Are we still checking in? Oh, is that yeah? So I'll go. So I'm not at this point yet. I'm appraising the studies that I've got. So I'm not at synthesis. I I'm not like massively concerned because I feel like I'll just get it done. I suppose the questions I have is that all of my studies are quantitative. So if there is stuff today around kind of what that means in terms of numbers and data that I need to pull rather than telling a story, which is telling a story is more my interest. And I suppose also where I'm at is I'd quite like this to feel a bit more fun, because it doesn't really for me personally, and I feel like maybe it could, and maybe that's some energy that I need to inject into it somewhere.
I can go next. I'm kind of feeling excited, Georgina. So I'm like, this is fun. Sorry. So the fun part for me is when you say intimidating around the synthesis, I can understand that some areas I've not done personally, so there's like a nervousness around, but the excitement or the fun for me really is coming into this idea that we can add something that's ours into this analysis, into the synthesis, because we're not doing a research from scratch. We're not going out there and doing the study. So with all of these papers, all the studies that have been done, that's like outside of our control. We, Donna and I, can contribute our thoughts, our experience, our how we make sense of the synthesis process. And that's like our contribution. So that's the bit that excites me, Georgina. So hopefully I'm just holding on to that for this process. But like he said as well, we're not at synthesis yet. We've got our studies and we're just in that MMAT process at the moment. So it's coming up soon. So this is good timing. But I'm kind of having fun, guys.
I think I feel a combination of irritated. I'm really irritated with like I just always seem to be at the wrong place at the right, just the not being in sync irritates me. So I'm a little bit behind the synthesis. The interest is finally somebody's going to let me read some papers. That I quite like that bit that I can now look at things and read. So I'm interested to hear about what synthesis means. And yeah, I do need a little bit of I feel largely irritated, I have to say, but that's energy, isn't it? So I need to just see if I can get that going in the right way. And I'm interested in the parallel process. We're looking at attachment styles and burnout. I'm starting to feel there's a parallel process going on, and I'm not even fully through the process. So that's interesting. But yeah, I'm interested to see what other people come up with. But I don't like this not knowing what I'm doing next. And that's a personal thing for me. So I'm just going to hold on and see what happens.
I'm working with Wendy. That probably explains the irritation. Sorry.
No, it doesn't at all.
I'm just thinking about it was a real basic level for me. What is synthesis? And once I understand what that is, and I think that's what we're going to do today, I'll have a lot better idea. So looking forward to it. Thank you.
I'll go next. I always like to know what's beyond, and I think today is going to be really helpful because knowing what's beyond where I am at the moment is going to make me feel unstuck, because when I don't know the whole picture, that really confuses me. What am I going to do with all this data, information I've gathered so far, which I'm still behind. But once I'm there at that stage, if I know what's coming next, it's just going to make the path a bit more clearer. Thank you.
I'm not quite at synthesis yet. I already feel like I've been on such a roller coaster of trawling and then doubting my question and then wondering what I'm even looking for and having to clarify that. So I'm kind of excited to get to the point where, right, okay, I've got this hodgepodge of papers that I've ended up with, and it is a bit of a hodgepodge for mine. Where what's the thread that I can see in what's in front of me? So yeah, I'm actually really looking forward to this bit, and hopefully there's a nice recipe that Antonio can give us.
Susie and I aren't at this stage yet either, but it's reassuring to know that we're not the only ones. But I'm interested in learning if you have any tips on guiding us through this stage. So that would be helpful. I'm making loads of notes. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm definitely not at this stage yet. At the moment, it just feels way over there. But actually, it might be really helpful having a bit of reverse engineering, I guess, of knowing actually what I need from this point and what I'm going to need, and then hopefully it'll all just come together. So I think it's actually, I don't know, we'll find out, but helpful to do it maybe this way, or I'll just keep telling myself that anyway. And
Susie, are you coming in?
Yeah, I feel a bit bit overwhelmed, I suppose, because we're not quite at that stage, although we're getting there. But yeah, I think because it's just so new, I just don't really understand. I don't understand it. I'm really looking forward to actually reading the papers. I can't wait to do that bit. That's been a bit of a tease because we've been seeing things and thinking, I can't wait. And then obviously we've got to keep marching through and making decisions and stuff. But yes, I hope it gets a bit more fun because, like Georgina, I'm not finding it fun at all. I'm finding it quite sort of hard going. So I hope it does get a bit more fun. Thank you.
Thanks, Susie. Alison, I think, is it just you?
Yeah, I'm not at this stage yet. See what happens. I'll be honest, most of it's kind of going over my head a little bit today. So yeah, I think it's going to be let it go over and then kind of come back and process it in smaller chunks. But yeah, but thank you.
Thank you. I think that's everybody, isn't it? Checked in. Yeah. I'll hand back over to you, Antonio.
Thank you. And just before I continue, what I would want to say is that for those of you who are at the synthesis stage, or if you haven't gotten to the synthesis stage, it is basically the light at the end of the tunnel. As I said before, you obviously have put in a tremendous amount of work, and the synthesis itself will continue to be another rung in the ladder of work of systematic review. But ultimately, it's where I mean, if you trust the process, it is where everything comes. It literally is where everything comes together and starts to make sense. And so that is what the purpose of this lesson here is today. Okay, so having said that, let me just start sharing again. Okay, so we've had our check-in, and now, so I think one of the good things about the discussion we had just now is the fact that there seems to still be some misunderstandings about, some hesitation, I should say, about what the synthesis process is going to entail. And so I think before that, one good thing to do is to just do a brief overview of what a synthesis is not. And maybe that'll put to rest some of the fears or anxieties that some people might have. So, what is a synthesis not? It is not a summary. So synthesizing goes beyond just restating or rehashing what every study has found. It's not just saying, authors X found, that there were 50% of people who agreed with this position, whereas author Y said that there were only 20%. Summaries basically just describe, but the synthesis actually interprets and explains. So bear that in mind. What you are doing in the synthesis process is interpreting what everyone has said and then explaining that from your own perspective and your own lens. A synthesis is also not just listing studies in chronological or alphabetical order. You must organize the findings analytically, not administratively. So you're not being secretaries, you're not just filing, you're not, because if that was the case, then you could, essentially there's software nowadays and AI that can just analyze, can just basically just extract data and organize it in whatever manner, whatever pattern you choose to do. What you're doing, and which basically even a lot of software today can't do is taking that a step further, literally reading what has been written in the context of your research question, of your own framework, of your own experience that you have, bring this as a researcher, and then putting that together into something that is brand new, that really not even AI can do, because AI, essentially, even the best AI are just very good at summarizing, but they're not very good at making new insights from the body of knowledge that they work with, and that's where human insight is actually irreplaceable. Synthesis is also not just vote counting. So as I briefly touched on when I talked about summaries, it's not just saying 5 studies found X, 3 found Y, because that is not analysis. That is just, again, just restating information that is already out there. So therefore, context, quality, and theoretical coherence are what actually matter more than just numerical tallies. Somebody mentioned about quantitative studies. This is not to say that when you're working with quantitative data that you're not going to be generating tables and graphs and saying, for example, what the comparison was between 5 or 6 different studies. Obviously, that is important, and we will get to that stage eventually. But what it is saying is that while data has its place, and while data is obviously going to be the backbone by which you make empirical analysis and empirical decisions and interpretations, ultimately just restating that data is not enough. It is about more than just um, putting all of the information or all of the findings in one place, although that is useful for when you're starting your thinking process. But you then have to actually see what is similar, what is dissimilar, and importantly of all, what are the common threads and what are the gaps in your actual synthesis. Which leads us into the final category of what a synthesis isn't, and it is not save the analysis for discussion. So the synthesis is the analysis. It is not just I am going to be taking all of these studies that I found, extracting the data, saying what the various authors say, or listing all of the information that has been extracted from all of these various studies or interventions. It is actually interpreting, the key being interpretation, and then reinterpreting that within your own research question, your own experience as a researcher, and then seeing what actually binds and unites all of these studies and where there are critical gaps in the literature, which is where potentially new research could be found or actually grow in the future. And so the discussion section interprets your synthesis, but it doesn't replace it. And we'll go in more depth into what this actually means as we go along with the presentation. So briefly, if we had to put that into a statement, what we could say is across studies, the therapeutic alliance emerged as a central mechanism of change. However, its influence was not uniform. Strong associations with outcome were most evident in long-term therapies and in studies where alliance was conceptualized relationally rather than as a measurable trait. This suggests that alliance functions less as a static variable and more as a co-constructed process shaped by therapeutic context and model. So this is an example of a synthesis statement. If you look at it closely, you can see that, first of all, what they did was find the central theme, the thread that ran across all of these different studies. So by saying the therapeutic alliance emerged as a central mechanism to change, and then also pivoting very quickly into where there was a gap. However, its influence was not uniform. And then you go on to explain why that influence was not uniform, where the major differences were, what were the challenges, and so on and so forth. And so this is just a brief example of what your synthesis statement could potentially look like based on the data that you're working with. So if we know what a synthesis isn't, what is a synthesis in that case? It does involve a great deal of interpretation. So again, moving beyond the question of what did they find to more into a question of what might this actually mean. So interpretation in that sense requires engagement with theory and context. And this is where you really, really have to just, as simple and self-evident as this may sound, you really have to put your thinking caps on and say, okay, so 5 different studies have found 5 different things. related to, for example, childhood neglect. But what does that actually mean in the wider body of literature, and what does it actually mean for the research that I'm trying to conduct or my research question? So it's not just enough to say what was discovered, what was revealed by various authors in their papers. You have to actually then take it a step further and say, what do they have in common, and what are they still not answering as a body of literature? Which leads to the second point. Synthesis is pattern recognition. So identifying where ideas converge, where they diverge, where there are contradictions, even by papers by the exact same author. So maybe an earlier paper by an author found one finding, and this was later contradicted by another paper by the exact same author that was done maybe 5 years later. That could be an interesting discussion in and of itself. And the silences across your data set. And silences, again, is just another way of saying the gaps. So all of these very brilliant people got together, did an intervention or did a study or analyzed some data, and they found very interesting things. But there were many things that they did not answer, either because they never thought of it or because the data was just not available at the time to answer it for whatever reason. So patterns aren't always obvious. Sometimes you have to look for them, and sometimes the pattern is that there simply is something that is not discussed in all, across the body of literature that you've been looking at. So what synthesis also requires is comparison. So examining how findings differ by context, again, building on the previous 2 points. The methodology. So if 2 authors came to the same conclusion, but they used different methodologies, why could that be? Could there be discrepancies in what one author chose to look for and what another chose not to look for? Is it indicative of anything that they came to the same conclusion even though they use different methodologies? What does that say about future studies going forward? Could these 2 methodologies potentially be merged, or should they remain separate? So, and these are all questions that I'm throwing out, and obviously it would be on you as the researcher to answer these questions and ultimately come to a decision about how the data that you're finding has meaning, and how it works within the broader framework of the question that you're trying to answer. So methodologies, populations, theoretical frameworks, and exploring why these differences might exist in the first place. Synthesis is also about meaning making. I would actually argue that this is perhaps the biggest takeaway from when you're actually trying to conduct a synthesis. You are really trying to make sense of this distilled body of knowledge. So you've done the search, you have your search terms, you have your inclusion exclusion criteria, you've decided which articles you're going to keep. You are now working with them. As many of you said, you're very eager to start to dive into that body of literature and see what the papers are actually saying. But that then leads to the question of making meaning from all of these papers. So constructing coherent explanations that integrate findings into theoretical frameworks or practice implications. That is really at the heart of what synthesis is about. However, there's other things to bear in mind. For example, ethical responsibilities, of course, recognizing that your synthesis will shape practice and policy. So you do have weight on your shoulders in that sense. After you have essentially synthesized all of this data from all of these various authors, and you have decided that one particular methodology or one particular frame of interpretation has not proven to be as useful as it should be, then what does that say about future research going forward? And how would somebody picking up your body of work, if you choose to publish what you've synthesized as a paper, how would they then interpret that, and how would they use that to construct their own study going forward? And what implications would that have for the subjects that they might be working with? Very big questions, and we're not here to answer those questions today, but we're here to throw those questions out and say that it has to be considered in the overall framework of doing a synthesis. So, for example, just to finish on this point, overclaiming or misrepresenting evidence has real-world consequences. So it's important, as we're going to be seeing later on, to not overstate what you have found or what you have not found. So you are going to be a steward of knowledge. You are not reporting findings, you are constructing understanding. And this framing positions you as a knowledge steward rather than a passive conduit of information. So you are not, again, just a secretary, you are a steward. You are curating this information into a coherent narrative, and therefore you have responsibilities. The responsibility to represent the evidence fairly, to acknowledge uncertainty. If you do not know something, you just simply do not know it. That then leads to limitations about what we can or cannot say from all of these studies, and to make transparent choices and to interpret thoughtfully rather than recklessly. And I think, again, this should be fairly evident, but it bears saying that if you are able to only say one thing and one thing only from all of the studies that you have found and synthesized, then it is better to state that one thing that you have found very clearly and concisely, rather than trying to overinterpret or rather than trying to stretch that out into a narrative that basically is not supported by the body of evidence. So that's just something important to bear in mind. Synthesis in that sense is not neutral or objective in the positive sense. Your theoretical commitments, your disciplinary background, and personal experiences will inevitably shape what you notice, how you categorize, and what you choose to emphasize or not emphasize. And in this sense, and I think Joe would be in a better position to explain this than I could, level 7 work requires you to acknowledge this openly through reflexivity, which will be addressed later on in session. But the important point to take away is that none of us is unbiased, but so long as you acknowledge your biases and the position or the framework which you're taking in interpreting your data and why you choose to take that particular position or why you choose to interpret through a particular lens, so long as you are very transparent and very forthright in explaining that and in justifying why you choose to interpret your data through a particular lens, that will go a long way in saving you a lot of trouble and a lot of headache in terms of whatever criticisms might come your way later on. And finally, we have a discussion prompt again. And in this case, what we're looking at is in what ways might your role as a knowledge steward differ from that of a primary researcher? So somebody working from scratch, essentially. And what unique ethical considerations arise when synthesizing others' work? Again, I will ask Joe to step in and say, would it be okay for us to take a pause right here to discuss this?
Yeah, I think that would be a really good idea.
Okay, Joe, so I'll just temporarily stop sharing.
So the question was, in what ways might your role as a knowledge steward differ from that of a primary researcher? So in other words, in what way does your role differ from bringing everybody else's work together to someone who's doing that primary research, and what unique ethical considerations arise when synthesizing others' work? What comes to mind? Feel free to unmute.
It's my biases, that's something which is becoming more and more evident because of my past experiences. So being reflective all the time is really needed. Yeah, and that's quite challenging for me.
I suppose it's how you word, you're part of this larger body of professional team, aren't you? So the people who've gone before and done that research, you're connected to. So it's how you handle what they've done respectfully, but not dip into not daring to disagree. It's that balance, isn't it? It's being respectful of what's gone before, but not being tempted to just go along with it or dismiss it without thought. Is that making sense?
I think for me, because of the nature of my question as well, I think some of it is not being an academic is part of it. Being, my interest in what I'm looking at. A lot of the papers that I'm looking at are testing the effectiveness of an intervention. But what I want to know is, what are they actually do? Where that intervention is shown to work, what are they actually doing? So it's me being a therapist and saying, yeah, but what are you actually doing in the room? If we slice up what you're calling an intervention, what does that actually mean? So it's kind of I'm bringing in being a therapist and wanting to know what's going on in the room rather than the kind of their presentation of what that intervention is. I'm kind of I'm trailing off there, but there's something around that.
Are you saying you want to know what the ingredients are that make the cake?
Yes, yes, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
I suppose my understanding of this is then that we're looking at what has already been said, thought about, considered, and researched, rather than us taking a research question and looking for an answer with that research. We'll find an answer that maybe these other collectives have come up with or that they haven't thought about. And I think in terms of our own question, that's partly we sort of suspect by looking through these papers that these aren't things that have been researched, but we're not doing that piece of research. We're either looking for similar findings, we're either looking for areas that haven't been explored in a particular area. So, but what I'm gaining from this is the understanding that we're not coming up with a conclusion as to the actual research itself, because we're looking at others' research, and then maybe there is a gap for somebody else to pick up and think about. If any of that makes sense. Not really sure, but hey ho.
Yeah, I would just quickly would like to say that you do have the gist of it, in the sense that it is about looking to, again, find what the common threads are throughout the literature, and then as well, if there is a gap, then to state what that gap is clearly and how that could potentially be addressed by future research. But again, by not overstepping, by not trying to suggest what form that future research may take, but merely by acknowledging that there is, or that there are gaps, and that they could potentially be met in the future.
Joe,
coming up
sorry,
Go
sorry.
on, Donna.
Just I don't know if we're recording. Rouge has had to disappear, so okay.
Yeah, I am recording. Thank you. I guess what's coming up for me as I'm listening to Antonio and I'm listening to some of the things that are coming to the room is it's very much like working with clients, isn't it? Actually, what we're doing is we're being really tentative. We're not saying this is black and white, this is the answer. We're saying, I'm wondering if, maybe not wondering, but, what's coming out of this. Am I hearing that right, Antonio? It seems like there's a crossover here with therapy.
My background isn't in therapy, so I can't speak to that. But what I can say is that when it comes to the synthesis process, regardless of whether it's qualitative or quantitative data, tentative would be the best word to describe the approach that you would take. Very cautious, not assuming, not jumping to hasty conclusions. Essentially, taking what would be called, I guess, in theoretical and in research terms, a grounded approach, which is essentially letting the data speak for itself, and then seeing what patterns naturally emerge from the data, if any patterns emerge. And within those patterns, there can be gaps, or they can be, in some cases, again, depending on the papers that you're working with, the data that has been extracted, there may be one common thread, or there may be actually multiple threads that run across various studies. But that is the ultimate idea of being very tentative, and again, not overstating or overinterpreting, as the case may be.
I don't know about everyone else in the room, but that for me just feels really freeing, because that is exactly what we do with clients, isn't it? If we put it in that context.
Absolutely. Yeah, sorry, that allowing it to speak for itself, that's what we're allowing our clients to do. We're not coming to conclusions, they are.
Okay, shall we move on?
Okay, well, if there's no further comments or questions, I'm happy to continue. So I will just start sharing my screen again. Okay, so we've had our discussion. So now we come to our first of several critical points in this lecture today. And what we will be discussing first of all is why method choice matters. So the synthesis approach you select isn't merely a technical decision. It's not just about what works best for what type of data or what type of research question you have. It also fundamentally shapes the kind of knowledge that you can produce. So in other words, just the same way that if you are cooking or making preparing some food in the kitchen, if you only have access to a range top, that limits your ability to what you can make compared to if you have access to, like, say, a microwave or a proper oven. The methodology that you choose to work with will, by its very nature, shape what you can actually produce or interpret from the data. The claims you can make are also limited by this, and the credibility of your conclusions, most importantly. So this choice that follows from your research, it should follow from your research question and the nature of your data itself. Again, based on what you're working with, that will then determine what would be the best methodology to go forward with. So just to put that a bit more clearly, your method of choice will actually shape your conclusion. So different methods foreground different aspects of your data. Thematic analysis highlights lived experiences. Meta-analyses emphasize effect sizes, and each reveals certain truths while potentially obscuring others. So it's not about right or wrong. It is about what works best for the question that they're trying to answer, as well as what type of data you have on hand. As stated before, it also shapes your claims. So your chosen method defines the strength and types of claims you can responsibly make. Narrative synthesis, for example, supports nuanced contextual claims, whereas a meta-analysis enables statistical generalization when appropriate. So if you're working in a very data-heavy analysis or synthesis, then perhaps that might be the methodology you might want to go with. And then finally, it shapes credibility, because obviously, if you come to a conclusion, or if you say, I have found this unifying theme across all papers, or I have found this gap across all papers, then how do you actually back that up? Why should anyone actually believe you? So in this sense, inappropriate method choices undermine, or they can potentially undermine, your entire review. Obviously, one of the main things that trips up a lot of reviewers, a lot of people who are writing papers, regardless of whether you're working in quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods, whatever it may be, whatever the topic may be, you can have the most robust analysis possible. But if your methodology of how you actually arrive to that analysis, how you actually arrive to your interpretations, why you chose to actually, again, interpret within a particular lens or use a particular framework for your analysis, if that is not actually justified, if you don't have a proper rationale behind why that was done, that will undermine everything else and all of the hard work that you've actually been doing so far, which would be extremely unfortunate. So, for example, using meta-analysis on heterogeneous qualitative studies, or a narrative synthesis when quantitative pooling is possible and appropriate, damages your scholarly credibility, just to give you some examples. So, very important to actually decide why you're doing what you're doing, as with any type of analysis or study. So let's have a very brief look at what the main approaches are, shall we? And we have here a table that will be basically filled out in terms of the approach, what it is best used for, what the primary output from that approach is going to be, and what the key characteristics of that particular approach are. So to begin, we have, oh, sorry, been going. We have the narrative approach. This is best used in a context whereby there is mixed design or where you're trying to explore the relationship between two different variables or two different participants in a study, or potentially two different types of interventions. The primary output is the story or the patterns and relationships that emerge. And the key characteristic is it is flexible and it is theory driven. Next, we have the thematic approach, which is best utilized for qualitative studies. Its primary output is analytical themes, and the key characteristics include inductive coding process. So if you have any experience so far in coding, again, I'm not sure what has or hasn't been covered in the length of this course, but this is where your coding would basically be coming in, and in terms of looking at the various themes and looking at them analytically. Next, we have the framework approach, which is basically looking, which is basically works best for studies with preset structure. They primarily produce populated matrices or models. And this is more of a deductive organizational process in terms of its characteristics. Finally, we have the meta-analysis, which is best used for homogeneous quantitative trials. It's ideal for when you're basically trying to produce pooled effect sizes. And its key characteristic is basically statistical aggregation. So this is where, if you're working with very data-heavy studies, you might want to look into a meta-analysis as a potential methodology going forward. So that's just a brief bird's eye view of what these various approaches are, what they're good for, what they primarily produce, and what the key characteristics are. And I think if you are at the synthesis stage, I know not all of you are, but if you are, then you may be getting an inkling at this point in time, based on what the studies you're working with, what the papers you're working with are, which one of these 4 approaches may actually be best for you. So we'll explore each approach in more depth over the next few slides, with particular attention to narrative and thematic synthesis and the methods most commonly used in counseling and psychotherapy systematic reviews. Many reviews draw on more than one synthesis approach, and these boundaries are analytic, not necessarily fixed in stone. So let's start first with the narrative synthesis. The narrative synthesis is good, or has an advantage in the sense that it is flexible. It takes an interpretive approach particularly well suited to reviews that include diverse study designs and that aim to explore relationships between concepts rather than aggregate numerical data. So again, you're looking here primarily at the relationships between concepts rather than trying to work with raw data and just or aggregate or pool all of the data together to try to get more of a quantitative outlook. The term narrative does not mean unconstructed storytelling. Rather, what it means is, or what it refers to, is constructing a coherent account that explains patterns across studies. So here we go back to this recurring theme of basically finding what the common thread is across all of these studies and then weaving that into something that is coherent. In other words, your own narrative. So one way of getting into a narrative synthesis is, for example, by grouping studies. So organize studies into meaningful categories based on intervention type, the population of interest, the context, the theoretical approach, or the outcome domain. It also involves exploring relationships, so examining how findings relate to one another, and asking the question, do certain contexts strengthen effects? Or do methodological differences explain divergent findings? Again, going back to the question asked earlier, if two researchers working on the same question come to completely different conclusions, is that just a reflection of the fact that basically they have used different methodologies, or is it because of something else that cannot be explained simply by the methodology itself within the papers? This then leads us to basically asking another important question, which again is explaining the patterns that we find, developing explanatory frameworks that account for convergence, divergence, and contradictions in the evidence base. And when looking at this, one source of information or one key reference is Pape et al. From 2006, and the guidance on the conduct of narrative synthesis in systematic reviews, which provides detailed methodological guidance and practical tools for conducting rigorous narrative syntheses. So that is something that you might want to take note of. It's a very good guide in terms of how you would conduct a narrative synthesis. So I hope this has been clear in terms of how a narrative synthesis operates. We'll now be looking at a thematic synthesis, and thematic synthesis was actually developed by Thomas and Harden. It adapts primary qualitative analysis techniques for synthesis of qualitative research. It's particularly valuable when you review questions focused on experiences, perspectives, or processes rather than effectiveness or outcomes. So again, you're looking at what the experience of the participants were, what their perspectives were, and what the processes behind that research was, rather than looking at whether trying to answer the question of whether it was effective in terms of particular outcome. Again, it involves line-by-line coding. So code finding from each study, staying close to the original author's interpretations, whilst also beginning to develop your own analytical category. So it's a fine line to walk, whereby, again, you don't want to, as we have discussed before, overstep and say something that was not found by authors, but at the same time, you're holding on to those different ideas and slowly letting them accumulate in your mind so that you can come to your own conclusions and seeing if there are any patterns that are emerging based on this coding. Emerge, you are beginning to make tentative groups, but you're not coming to a definitive conclusion just yet. And then finally, the analytical themes, which is developing analytical themes that go beyond the primary studies to generate new interpretive insights and answer and review your review questions. So one key reference for this is, of course, Thomas and Harding from 2008, Methods for the Thematic Synthesis of Qualitative Research in Systematic Reviews. This is from the British Medical Council Medical Research Methodology, and of course you can find this paper for free online. The paper essentially provides the foundational methodology and worked examples if you want to actually see how Thomas and Harding actually did this in real studies. Next, we'll be moving on to a framework synthesis. So framework synthesis uses pre-existing theoretical models, conceptual frameworks, or logical models to construct the synthesis process. So we're not starting from scratch. Rather than allowing themes to emerge purely inductively, you map findings onto the framework's components, comparing how different studies populate for, each element. So in other words, we're already working with a framework synthesis with a particular framework, as it were, of how to interpret this data. And this, in some instances, makes your work easier because you don't have to develop the actual framework of how you're going to interpret this data. You just have to fill it in. But then the task then becomes on you to actually see how the similarities or differences emerge from filling this in as you go along. So when should you actually use a framework synthesis? You would use it when a robust theoretical framework exists in your field. So if there is already an established framework for how you would answer a particular question, this has been tried and tested, then perhaps it would make sense to work with a framework synthesis. For applied or practice-focused reviews where implementation framework guides the work. Also, when comparing findings across different contexts using common structure, and when stakeholders require findings organized around specific policy or practice domains. So if you have a funder, which may not be the case at this point in time, but if you have a funder who already has a particular framework that they want to work with or a particular domain that they're comfortable with, then you may find yourself trying to fit your data or your findings into that pre-existing framework rather than starting from scratch inductively. However, there are some key considerations, and these include, for example, the fact that the framework shapes what you look for and how you organize findings. So you are not, again, going in with an open mind. That has to be said from the get-go. You are working with a pre-existing framework for actually understanding the data that you're going to be extracting. And this brings clarity and structure, but it also has the risk of overlooking aspects that don't fit into the framework. So as I'm sure are already aware, whenever you come with a set mind and worldview, whether you come with a set paradigm for actually interpreting data, whether it be qualitative, quantitative, or mixed as the case may be, the beauty of that is that, again, you already have half the work done for you in the sense that you already know or already have slots, as it were, that you can fit your data or your findings into. However, if you find out that certain aspects of the data or certain findings or certain components of the methodology don't quite fit into that pre-existing paradigm, then what do you do? And what implications would that have going forward in terms of how you actually explain the commonalities and the gaps in the data if they do not fit into a pre-existing framework? So you can see already how this synthesis method actually has its challenges. However, as I said before, if you find that your framework is very robust and accommodates all or almost all of the various aspects or codes that you're trying to work with, then it may be worth working within a particular framework than starting from scratch. But again, that is something that you will have to decide as a researcher. Again, on a case-by-case basis, based on what your research question is and based on the body of literature that you happen to be working with. So it's important to maintain openness to unexpected findings and be prepared to adapt or critique the framework if the evidence demands it. Again, that would be a natural outcome if you find out that no matter how good your framework is, it still has a lot of gaps or still has a lot of answers that it cannot answer on its own. So that then leads us to another question of why meta-analysis is rare in counseling research. You may have encountered meta-analyses in medical or educational research and wondered why they're less common in counseling and psychotherapy reviews. And the answer lies in the nature of therapeutic work and the assumptions underlying meta-analytic techniques. The first major issue is context variability. So therapeutic relationships unfold in specific cultural, relational, and temporal contexts. Pooling effect sizes assumes that these contexts are irrelevant or exchangeable, which oftentimes they're not, and a problematic assumption for contextually sensitive interventions. So where context is key, and context is very often at the heart of this type of work that you guys do, very, very key in understanding why a particular client or clients or a particular demographic is struggling with a particular issue, then meta-analysis might not do justice to this. Also, there is the issue of complex relational processes. So as you well may know, therapy involves dynamic co-constructed processes that resist reduction to discrete measurable doses. Not everything can necessarily be put in a box and labeled and quantified and neatly classified and put away. And so in that sense, meta-analysis works best with standardized interventions delivered with fidelity, very quantitative work, and rarely in the reality of counseling process or the counseling practice. And then finally, there's the false precision risk. Aggregating heterogeneous studies into a single effect size can create an illusion of precision while obscuring meaningful variation. In other words, when you have this body of research that has been done using various methodologies in various different contexts, with the various different demographics, under various different circumstances, um, trying to reduce all of that into a single coherent narrative using, for example, quantitative data is at best risking the potential of underinterpreting or overinterpreting what the data says, but also more importantly, it obscures a lot or just basically ignores a lot of information that would be useful in terms of understanding the overall the overall body of knowledge, or for example, more importantly, looking to see what the gaps are. So it's just oftentimes not a very good fit, especially when, as I said before, you're working in a very context-heavy environment, and meta-analysis is basically trying to level out all of that context and essentially erase it. So as one researcher stated quite rightly, human attachment really fits into neat decimals. And of course, that is just the nature of what you do in psychotherapy. However, this does not mean that quantitative synthesis is never appropriate. It means that you must carefully consider whether your data and research questions generally warrant it. And again, this is something that you alone will actually know based on what you're working with, what the literature is like, and essentially what your research question is. So I hope that that was very clear. Last note that I'd want to make is that meta-analysis is a valid form of synthesis only when its assumptions are met. So again, knowing what the underlying assumptions are for meta-analysis will go a long way into helping you to determine whether or not it is the best approach to take when trying to conduct a synthesis. So this then leads us to our next section, which is the critical decision question of what kind of knowledge does my data allow me to produce responsibly? And here is where we actually start getting into the real crux of what type of what form your synthesis should take. The question should guide your synthesis method choice. It requires honest appraisal of your data's nature, quality, and homogeneity, alongside clear thinking about your review's purpose and your epistemological commitments are. Try to ask yourself the question, am I trying to estimate an average effect, explore variations in experiences, identify mechanisms, or map a field, or develop a theory? Because each purpose may call for a different approach, and each of them will actually call for a different approach, as the case may be. And your choice then is to be defensible, transparent, and aligned with both your research question and the evidence that you've actually assembled. So again, just to reiterate what has been said before, let your research question be your guide, and let your evidence also be your guide in terms of what type of actual approach would be the best for handling your synthesis process. So this then brings us to a mini activity of justifying your choice, and this is where we have a reflection task. We'll ask you to take 5 minutes to write brief responses to the following prompts. And the purpose of this exercise will be to help you to crystallize your thinking about synthesis method selection for your own review. So I'm going to read out these 4 questions, and obviously you guys will afterwards have 5 minutes to think about this, reflect about it. The first one being, which synthesis method am I leaning towards for my review? Why does this method suit my research question and data? What specific kinds of knowledge will this method enable me to produce? And finally, what are the limitations of this approach for my particular review? So don't worry if you're not entirely clear yet. As many of you have already mentioned, you haven't gotten to the synthesis stage yet. However, the synthesis method choice often becomes clearer as you work with your data and you know what type of data that you're working with, what type of studies have emerged. And the important thing to take away at this point is to begin to think critically about the relationship between method and the knowledge claims you can make. So again, very briefly, what synthesis method am I leaning towards for my review? Maybe you already have an idea in mind. What does this method, why does this method suit my research question and data? What specific kinds of knowledge will this method enable me to produce? And what are the limitations of this approach for my particular review? So again, I think that this will be a time for me to stop sharing and for you guys to start working. Joe, I don't know how you wanted this to actually work out in terms of, is this going to be an individual task?
I think it would be good actually if I pop you into some breakout rooms with the people that you're working with. So just give me a sec while I sort that out for you. Donna, would you want to just pop in with somebody else? Yeah, is that okay? So if I put you and Joe together, that would be hang on, room 3. So Susie and Sharon, yep, you need to go up there. Okay, Sharon, and Shirin, I'll put you in with Joe and Donna as well because that's the 3 of you. So we've got Sharon and Susie. Antonio, you'll get a invite, but just ignore it. Phil and Wendy, Georgina and Joe. Yes, okay. So I'll open the rooms. Shall we say 15 minutes? Is that okay? And then we can come back and have a break. Yeah?
Yeah, it's 10:15, so that would basically mean that we reconvene at 10:30.
Yeah, we'll reconvene at 10:30 and then we'll have a break before we go into the next bit. Okay, here's your rooms. I'll see you in 15 minutes. Okay. Thank you, Antonio. Whenever you're ready.
Okay, so I'll start sharing now. Okay, so we're now at the stage where we're asking the critical question, what kind of knowledge does my data allow me to produce responsibly? And I think we've been having a very productive discussion so far in terms of the various research questions that everybody has, the various kinds of data that people are working with, and what the data can and cannot do. And therefore, by extension, what type of approach would that necessitate taking? So just to briefly recap, the question should guide your synthesis method choice. It requires honest appraisal of your data's nature, its quality, and homogeneity, alongside clear thinking about your review's purpose and your epistemological commitments. Furthermore, again, you should be asking yourself, am I trying to estimate an average effect, explore variations in experiences, identify mechanisms, map a field, or develop a theory? Because each purpose may call for a different approach, and your choice should be defensible, transparent, and most importantly, aligned with both your research question and the evidence base that you have already assembled. So we have done this mini activity, and now we'll be moving from the extraction stage to the interpretation stage, which is really, again, at the heart of the whole synthesis process. So extraction and synthesis are distinct phases requiring different cognitive orientations or different frames of thinking. And understanding this shift helps you to move productively from data collection to knowledge construction. So just as a very brief recap, what is it that you ask when you are extracting data? You may ask questions such as, what did the study find? Quite obvious. Here, the focus is on individual studies. You try to interpret what stance is being taken, whether it is descriptive and faithful. The output of the study, obviously, the data is whether or not the data is in standardized format. Orientation towards the particular. Whereas in synthesis, you may tend to ask instead, what does this mean across studies? So given the other studies that I have chosen or have made it through the filtering process, what does it actually mean in light of what other authors are saying? And what does it mean in terms of the broader body of literature that is out there? And so the focus in this case is on patterns and relationships compared to individual studies. The stance is interpretive and analytical compared to descriptive and faithful. The output is in terms of themes, models, and explanations, as opposed to your standard data model format, sorry, your standard format of presenting data. And finally, the orientation is towards the general instead of the particular. So the last point may seem a bit trivial, but actually, when you think about it, with extraction, you already have one particular goal in mind. You're trying to extract this data. You're trying to find out what is it that a particular study has found. What are the main outputs? What can you actually take away from what various authors are saying? Whereas, and it may seem counterintuitive at first, with the synthesis, you're actually going towards a more generalized understanding of the entire body of knowledge. And this just basically falls back on the point that I have made, and we are going to continue to reiterate throughout this lecture, which is that you are supposed to be, or you should ideally be, very cautious in ascribing any type of meaning from any data that you extract, and just generally take a very cautious and very tentative approach to when to interpret that data. So this isn't exactly a clean break because the synthesis actually builds on the extraction. Obviously, you cannot have one without the other. You wouldn't have a synthesis if you hadn't already extracted the data. However, the shift is in the focus, and it is actually real and necessary, because you are no longer documenting what individual studies have said. You're constructing meaning from the collective evidence. Hence why the orientation moves from being very specific to being very general. If you're focusing on what one particular study or group of studies have said, then you have a very disorganized approach, or a very disorganized understanding of the material. But where the synthesis comes in is by actually finding the commonalities, whether that be commonalities in the findings or the outcomes or the actual gaps that all studies share. So that then leads to the question of how to actually prepare your data set. So before diving into any type of synthesis, you need to actually make sure, or it has to be ensured, that your data set is thoroughly prepared. The preparation stage is often overlooked, but significantly affects the quality of your synthesis, and it also has an impact on what type of methodology you use going forward, what type of approach. But you have already begun doing this with the extraction process in most of your cases, and from extraction, the next logical stage is to move into interpretation. And so this lesson today is going to be focusing on the first stage of interpretation when working with the synthesis. So the first step to actually take is to revisit your quality appraisal, review your appraisal notes, ask questions such as which studies provided the most robust evidence, which had methodological limitations that might affect the confidence that you put in your findings. So again, this goes back to asking questions. For example, if two separate authors came to the same conclusion using different methodologies, does that say anything about the methodology in use? Or likewise, if the same question is being asked, but completely different conclusions are come to by different authors, then is there a commonality again in the methodology, or is that just an artifact of the data or the way that the study was designed? Secondly, you have to identify and handle weak claims. Consider, for example, whether studies with serious methodological flaws should be excluded from synthesis or given reduced weight. That is going to be a personal decision on your part. Again, depending on your inclusion-exclusion criteria, you will know whether or not a study meets the very bare minimum to actually be included. And even once it has been included in the final batch, could it be the case in some instances that the methodology was so compromised that it would be better to just exclude a particular study or studies? Or would they be included as a reference point to say what not to do? Again, this is something that you will know when you actually come to it. And all of this necessarily should be said would be documented thoroughly and transparently. Finally, you highlight the key findings, mark the findings that directly address your review questions, and distinguish the central findings from contextual or secondary observations. So, I mean, and again, this would seem obvious at first. All authors highlight what was the main finding in their conclusions. And then, of course, you have secondary findings that either support or contradict what the main finding says. Your role as researchers is basically to distinguish what those central findings are, and basically, in some cases where it's not clear, to determine what that main finding or findings are, and separate them from the context in which they're actually included, and actually to put them in their proper place when looking at secondary findings that may come from a particular study. So to build on that last point, what are central versus contextual findings and how do they differ? So obviously, not all findings deserve equal emphasis in your synthesis, and learning to distinguish central from contextual findings prevents your synthesis from becoming cluttered with peripheral details. So again, this is where being very focused and having a very sharp idea of what your research question is going to be coming in quite handily. Because this is basically where you determine what is important to actually extract from a paper versus what can actually be just considered supporting information, not necessarily vital to your overall analysis. So central findings directly address the review question. So this is important to note because not necessarily because a particular author or authors have highlighted what their main finding in their paper or their research is means that that is necessarily what you as an individual researcher should take as a central finding. It may be the case that something that is considered very peripheral, very tangential in the paper that you're actually reviewing by the main author is actually quite central to your overall analysis. Again, remember that when we're doing a synthesis, we're not necessarily just trying to summarize. We're not secretaries. What we're trying to do is see where the commonality of the themes lie and where the gaps lie between the entire body of research that we're looking at. And so what that means is sometimes, not necessarily always, but sometimes what would be stated as a minor finding or a secondary finding in a particular paper may actually be central to your particular research. And it's up to you to use your discretion and again, refer back to your original research question in this respect. As an example, in a review on therapeutic alliance in online therapy, a study is finding that, quote, clients reported feeling equally connected to therapists in video sessions as in face-to-face sessions would be central. So in that particular case, the underlying finding or the underlying bit of data that we got from that was that clients don't necessarily see a major difference or in their feelings, in their affect, when looking at or when interacting with therapists in video sessions versus a face-to-face session. Now, comparing that to contextual findings, they provide important background but don't directly answer your question, and they help you to understand the setting or explain variation. So this is where they play more of a supporting role, but they are not necessarily the main theme that emerges from the data that you're analyzing. And again, just to reiterate what was said earlier about whether or not to actually use a particular approach, such as meta-analysis or thematic or narrative, it's up to you as researchers to determine when asking that question, for example, in terms of what type of approach to take. All or most findings nowadays will contain some element of quantitative data, even if it is only just used in simple demographic information. But it is up to you to use your discretion and decide whether or not you want that quantitative data to take the center stage in your analysis, or whether it is going to play a more supporting role. If it is taking a more supportive role, then it becomes, by definition, more contextual in its nature. And an example of that would be the same study's observation that participants were predominantly white, middle class women is contextual, important to understanding limits to generalizability, but not a direct answer to the alliance question. So again, looking at this in a more holistic approach, what we could say is the researcher in this instance was more concerned with understanding whether or not the delivery method of therapy had an impact on the feelings that were generated in clients versus who these clients were and what their particular background stories may be. While that is important and while it may take center stage or be central for another type of research, in this particular instance, it played more of a supporting role, and so therefore it was more contextual in nature versus the central findings that the researcher was interested in. So finally, just to underscore that both types matter, but central findings form the substance of your synthesis, while contextual findings help you to interpret and qualify your conclusions. And all of this is basically to say, for those of you who have decided what type of approach that you want, looking at your central findings based on what your research question is going to go a very, very long way in helping you to determine what type of approach you should or shouldn't take, depending on what you want to actually be the main focus or the main driver behind your research question, or what you think will support your research question. So what is central for one person may be just peripheral or contextual for another person. Once you have found findings, they can obviously be grouped, and that is where you may decide to take a more narrative route. So for example, when conducting narrative syntheses, you need to organize findings into meaningful categories, and the grouping strategy that you choose should illuminate your research question and reveal patterns across studies. By mechanism, so for example, how does the phenomenon work? You can group the findings that describe similar processes, pathways, or mechanisms of change. So you're looking more at the actual process and the more underlying, sorry, you're looking more at the nuts and bolts of why a particular intervention worked or did not work. Where did it occur? Settings, so on. So that is the context. So if we want to look at the context, we'd be asking questions such as where did it occur, whether it was a school, a clinic, or online, the culture in which it occurred, and the socioeconomic context to explore new context shapes findings, or how context shapes findings. By population, for example, who does it affect? The age group, the demographics again, the diagnosis, demographic characteristics, or other population features to identify whom the findings hold. And by process stage. So for example, when does it happen? Organized chronologically by phase, early, middle, or late, and reveal the temporal patterns. So all of this has to be taken into consideration when you decide to go down the narrative route. And you may in fact use multiple grouping strategies in the same synthesis as long as each serves a clear analytical process or purpose. So whether you chose to do it mechanistically, by context, by population, or by the process stage, all of these are valid ways of organizing a narrative synthesis or route, or using the narrative approach, but it just depends on what you're most interested in. So another way, obviously, of grouping the findings would be using the thematic route. And a thematic synthesis follows a more inductive process. It builds categories from the data itself rather than imposing predetermined groupings. This approach is particularly valuable when exploring under-researched phenomena where existing frameworks may not adequately capture the complexity. So one other way of basically looking at this is if you're working in a highly underappreciated, understudied area, something that really has not been covered by the literature that is currently out there, then you may be tempted to take a more thematic route simply because it allows you more flexibility in letting the data speak for itself rather than trying to come with a predetermined paradigm or framework and then trying to fit it into that when in fact the data is too sparse or too unknown to actually fit into a pre-existing framework. So what would this actually involve? It involves line by line coding, so working through extracted findings systematically, assigning descriptive codes that capture the essence of each finding, and staying close to the language of the original studies initially. It also involves clustering codes, so looking for the codes that shape conceptual similarities, begin grouping related codes together, and creating provisional clusters that suggest emerging patterns. And then finally, based on what you've done before, you can develop labels and assign names to each cluster that capture its conceptual essence. And these labels become your preliminary descriptive themes. So you can actually see, as the name suggests, the purpose of a thematic route is to develop a central theme across all of the research that you have been doing, across all of the papers that you're looking at. But this is not going to be imposed. It's not going to come with a predetermined structure. You will actually let the data speak for itself, but having said that, there are stages to which you will actually extract the data and let it actually group naturally and form this overarching theme. And so those are basically the 3 stages that have been outlined here. So first of all, going by line coding, then clustering your codes based on what you notice are the similarities, and then basically developing labels at the end based on what your codes have actually revealed to you. So moving to a more descriptive theme, descriptive themes organize and summarize the content of your dataset without yet interpreting what it means. They represent a crucial intermediate stage between coding and analytical theme development. So what does this actually mean? So for example, if we wanted to code some papers that we were looking at, we may use terms such as the person felt heard, the therapist understood me, and someone finally gets it. How would this then be clustered logically? We could say potentially that all describe experiences of being understood. And then what would be the descriptive theme that would emerge from that? Feeling understood by the therapist. So you can clearly see the evolution from all of these various codes in their unique formulations, basically being listed, looking at to see what the underlying clustering theme is behind that, and then developing or articulating that theme at the end by actually putting it into one sentence or theme. Another example would be between session support, therapist available or availability, and could reach out. The logic behind that could be all related to accessibility, and the descriptive theme could be something like therapist accessibility and availability. And then finally, in terms of the examples of codes, we also have didn't feel judged, safe to share, and no criticism. We could say that that could be clustered by all about non-judgmental environments. And then finally, the descriptive theme that we would formulate from that would be non-judgmental therapeutic space. Oh, fine. Sorry, there is another one. Concrete suggestions, practical tools, and strategies I could use. They would be clustered by saying all reference actionable guidance. And the theme that would emerge from that is provision of practical strategies. So notice how descriptive themes stay fairly close to the data while beginning to abstract across studies. They're still describing what rather than explaining why or how. So we haven't quite gotten to the stage where we're being more analytical when we're actually trying to derive meaning, but we are getting closer to that by actually describing what we're seeing emerging from the literature. So that then leads us to the next stage, which is basically comparing across studies. At this point, once you've organized your findings into preliminary groups or themes, this is where the actual analytical work begins, the systematic comparison. And this is the stage whereby you would start to see patterns that no single study on its own could reveal. So what do we mean by that? There is, first of all, convergence. So asking a question such as where do the studies agree? Repeated findings across diverse contexts and methodologies strengthen confidence. Um, but at the same time, being aware of assuming consensus equals truth, because sometimes the entire field share blind spots. So in other words, just because various authors agree um, on what the outcomes or the aggregated outcomes of using a particular kind of therapy may be, doesn't necessarily mean that their findings are conclusive evidence of the effectiveness of that particular kind of therapy. What we're seeing instead is um, various researchers, various authors have tried a certain methodology, gotten a certain output, and now we can say with a high degree of confidence that there seems to be an emerging theme in terms of the use of a particular methodology, but we cannot say whether or not that is objectively the best methodology to use. Which then leads to our second point, which is divergence. So where do studies disagree or show different patterns? Divergence often reveals important moderating variables or contextual factors. And it is important to not smooth over contradictions, but rather to explore them, because what the studies do not say can oftentimes be just as important and just as interesting, or even more interesting than what they do say. Hence the reason why it opens up avenues for further research. And finally, leading on or building on the previous point, silence. So what is missing? Because absences can be as revealing as presences, and which populations or contexts or aspects of the phenomenon have been under research. Naming the gaps is valuable in scholarly work, and this can only emerge if you actually understand or have a firm grasp of what the convergences and divergences are in the literature. Of course, in saying all of this, context matters. So as you compare findings across studies, it is important to pay careful attention to contextual factors that might explain variation. Context, as we've said before, isn't just background noise. It often holds the key to understanding divergent findings. So as we're going to be seeing later on in our exercise, um, if we really want to develop our own unique interpretation of our body of literature that we're exploring, this is where context will make or break that actual stage. Um, it will actually help to launch you from the descriptive, what I would call a secretarial format, whereby you're just compiling data and restating it, which is basically just a summary, which is not what we want at this stage. And what actually helps to build or to build that to create that platform that allows you to delve deeper into the literature and to actually formulate your own unique perspectives is the context. So again, going on what was said earlier, while you will obviously have your core themes or your core information that will form the backbone of your thematic or narrative or meta-analysis, what ultimately is also going to support that is the contextual information. So this is where your methodology is very important. So for example, asking, does your study design affect findings? Experimental studies may show different patterns than naturalistic observational research, not because one is wrong, but because they capture different aspects of reality. So what was the study designed to do, and did it actually fulfill that purpose? Sample characteristics, so how the participant demographics or clinical presentations or other sample features relate to findings. These patterns may hold for some populations but not for others, so be careful not to overgeneralize. Settings, do findings differ by treating setting, country, healthcare systems, or practice context? Therapeutic processes may manifest differently in different organizational environments. And finally, cultural context, which is how might cultural norms, values, or communication styles shape the phenomenon under study. Cross-cultural variation can reveal assumptions embedded in Western-dominated research. And taking all of this into consideration, your methodology, your sample characteristics, your setting, your cultural context, you begin to see that while all of this information, while not being central to the overarching research question, will allow you to actually have a much more nuanced and much more in-depth understanding of the subject matter. And in that respect, it'll actually be, like I said, the foundation from which you'll actually build your own analysis and form your own conclusions and ultimately reveal what the commonalities are between various studies as well as what the gaps are. So now we come to the workshop activity, which is going to be hands-on practice. You guys are going to be working in groups for about 20 minutes. And what we are basically going to be doing is applying these concepts to real data, working with a small data set of extracted findings to practice grouping and beginning the actual thematic development process. So the first step of that is going to be to review the samples. We have 15 findings that have been extracted, and we're going to be reading through that. Just a second. Yes, okay, so Joe has actually provided that in the chat, so that's great. Yeah, so as I was saying, we have 15 findings that have been extracted. Your job is, first of all, to read through them and get a feel for the content. Secondly, you guys will be working in groups, and your task is essentially to organize the findings into 3 or 5 meaningful groups. Consider different grouping logics by mechanism, population, context, etc. And then finally, to develop provisional themes for each group by drafting a provisional theme label that captures its essence. So add 1 to 2 sentences, ideally one explaining what unifies the findings in that group. So just as just to go back very briefly, we see here in this, so this is exactly what you guys will be doing. You will be creating codes, clustering, and then finally coming up with a descriptive theme that ideally captures the heart of all of the codes that you have developed from these findings that you're going to be seeing. And of course, you can do this by looking at the convergence, the divergence, and what is missing. And then finally, deciding to contextualize it by methodology, by the sample characteristics, by the setting, or by the cultural context. I hope all of that is clear, and if it is, then I believe turning it over to Joe now, this is where you guys would be placed into groups, and then the 20 minutes would start whenever we're ready in terms of working on this practice.
Excellent. Thank you, Antonio. I have put you into some bigger groups. You are welcome at any point to call Antonio into your breakout room. You can call me, but I don't know how much help I'll be. Yeah, so if you need us, we are here. We're sitting waiting for you. Is everyone okay with what we're asking you to have a go at? Yeah, cool. Okay, here come your rooms, and we'll see you in 20 minutes. All right, Donna. I think she's gone. There, she's gone. Yeah. Oh, how are we doing for time, Antonio? Do you think 20 minutes is going to be long enough for them?
Yeah, I was gonna say we're about 20 minutes roughly from midday. So I would say, let me just have a quick look. We are on slide number 26. So yeah, so this is going to be basically the backbone of the lesson today. I think after this it's basically downhill, and the remaining slides we should be able to cover within the remaining hour.
Cool, excellent. That's fantastic.
So that would bring us right up to about midday in terms. Sorry, about 1 p.m. In terms of the finishing up.
Excellent. Yep. It would be really good to leave sort of 10 minutes towards the end just for them to ask any questions that they may have.
Yeah, bearing in mind, I mean, some of the slides are very descriptive or very self-evident in what they talk about. So I don't think that I need to necessarily linger on all of them.
No, I agree.
Oh, obviously they're going to be taking 20 minutes now. How long do we want to spend after that discussing what they found?
So we've got 27 to 40. So we've got 20 slides. Like you say, you could probably speed through some of these. We've got a couple of reflective prompts that they don't need to do here. So that's 2 slides less. So that's, yeah, I think this is probably going to be the crux of what's really important for them. Like you say, they can go back and they can read the slides, but starting to pick themes out is going to be the thing that I think I would, you know, so, and we've got another activity debrief. What surprised you during the group? These questions are. We've got another break, so we could just make a 10-minute break. I think spend a good 10 to 15 minutes on that afterwards. You don't even have to cover that slide, the reflective bit. They can go back to that.
Yeah, because I'm trying to strike a balance between what I'm trying to do in my presentation is not just read off slides, because obviously they can always go back and read it themselves. I'm trying to add some context, but I'm aware that I can't speak too long about a particular topic or sentence, because obviously we're bound for time. So yeah, just trying to keep that balance.
Yeah, I think it's a great balance. I think what you've put together is fabulous.
Well, I love the way that you put your slides together. I mean, I don't think I would have made them quite as aesthetic as you have. So that's you really you've done a good job at organizing things.
Well, I'll let you into secret. Gamma, it's AI. It does it all for you.
Oh, okay, that's nice. Yeah, I mean, I noticed the artwork is definitely AI, but I didn't realize it was that good at actually organizing the slides themselves.
Yeah, I just put in what you sent me and it did it very quickly. So
Nice.
yeah, I do then go and animate them, because I think it's better to have them animated than having all the text on the screen all at the same time.
Oh no, it's definitely overwhelming for students. So yeah, it's good to just drop it in one at a time. Yeah.
I'm just doing the lesson plan, so because we'll be running this again next year, and it may be that the tutors that are doing the teaching next year may contact you to run these 3 sessions for them.
Okay.
If you're available, that would be helpful.
Yeah. I like keeping my teaching skills sharp. So that would be something interesting to do.
So do you want to literally just skip over slides 42 and 43, 44? So you could hide those 3 slides if you want, and I can say to them at the end, there's some they will go back and look at the slides, but you could skip over those 3 slides and go straight to preparation for the next session.
Right. So you're saying 42 and 43.
42, 43, and 44.
Okay. Yeah, I can just mention them in passing, but not necessarily go over them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, no, I think it's been really good. There's another practical, isn't there? Using your find as your group's early activity, create one synthesis artifact. So you could say to them, actually, we don't have time for that today, but you can do that.
Yeah, they're free to do that on their own time.
Yeah, so that's number 38. Oh, as the study in the matrices, they're really going to be important for them to go through. But yeah, no, I think that's great. So if we go come back, have at least 10 minutes for feedback, 10-minute break, and then we've got from 12:20 until 1:50. 12:50, so that's 30 minutes to do. Yeah, you should have enough time. If you don't, you don't. They've got the slides. That's not a problem. Yeah, it's only about 10 slides actually if we cut those others out. So
Yeah.
that should be fine. Yeah. Cool. Well, feel free to take a break now yourself and then just come back in.
Yeah, I think I'll just have a glass of water and then I'll be back in just a few minutes.
Perfect. Okay, see you then.
Okay. Okay, welcome back everyone, and we'll continue with the remainder of today's lesson. Okay, so we have completed our activity and taken some time to reflect on that. Now what we're going to be doing is, well, I think we've already covered our activity debrief. So we've answered questions about what you were surprised about, what you found interesting, how did you decide where the boundaries were. I think you gave some very interesting answers in terms of how that may or may not have been as straightforward as you expected. And of course, someone also mentioned that the context of having read the articles helps a lot. So we're not going to dwell too much on this in the interest of time. And we have had our break. So now we'll be going from groups to actual meaning. And now that you've organized your findings into groups or descriptive themes, the next crucial step is moving from a description to analysis, and from asking what to asking why and how. And this is really where synthesis actually becomes generally interpretive, because we're moving away from, again, just being stenographers, just analyzing and grouping data for the sake of grouping it, or sorry, for the in terms of actually creating or identifying what the themes are, which is important. But now we are actually moving into asking why it matters that we choose to group our data a particular way. So at the descriptive level, it organizes and summarizes what studies have been found. We stay close to the original data, and it is useful for showing the landscape of existing research. As an example, we could say something such as studies consistently reported that clients valued therapist empathy. However, at the analytical level, we go a step further, and it involves interpretation and explains patterns. It moves beyond the studies to generate new insights, and it addresses your relevant question, your research question, with theoretical and conceptual depth. So an example of this would be, for example, empathy appears to function as a necessary but insufficient condition for alliance formation, requiring complementary therapist authenticity to generate trust. So in the second example, we're moving beyond just simply stating what we have found and actually taking it a step further and saying why this would be important, given the research question that we are attempting to answer. Notice how the analytical version offers explanatory details such as empathy as necessary but insufficient, and it also identifies relationships, for example, between empathy and authenticity, and it also goes further and proposes a mechanism, general trusting, that could be used to actually frame all of this. So this is the kind of thinking that level 7 work actually requires. We're going beyond just describing, we're actually saying, what does it mean, why is it important, and what could it potentially tell us about our own research question as well as for future research. So in terms of developing analytical themes, this is again another vital stage in the synthesis process. Analytical themes represent your interpretation of what the collected evidence means. They are called analytical because they go beyond the findings themselves to actually offer explanatory insights or theoretical contributions. And it's important to remember that analytical themes should be, or they should remain grounded in the synthesized data rather than introducing unsupported claims. So again, we're still threading a very careful line between faithfully reporting what was found or not found in individual studies, grouping that together into a coherent narrative or under particular umbrellas or themes, as the case may be, but we're still not actually, while interpreting this information holistically, we're not actually going to the stage of saying something that was not claimed by any of the particular authors. So we're asking questions such as, why does this actually occur? So that involves moving from describing a pattern to explaining why that pattern may potentially be happening, what theoretical framework might account for this finding, what psychological, social, or contextual mechanisms could be at the heart of the actual work. It also involves asking what mechanism might explain this. For example, identifying the processes through which effects occur or experiences unfold. And mechanisms seek to answer the how aspect of our synthesis. For example, questions that may arise and that often have implications for the practice. And finally, we're also asking the question, how do these themes relate? So analytical themes often exist in relationship. One may be a precondition for another, or they may represent different phases of a process. So mapping these relationships deepens your synthesis. And when you actually put all of them together, so we're asking the why behind a particular set of behaviors or a particular mindset. Then we're going a step further by actually asking, for example, what the mechanism behind this may actually be. So why does this come about? What causes it to come about? And then finally asking, now that we understand why our patients or population or study population may have a certain reaction to a certain intervention or environment, what does that then mean in terms of the themes that we have extracted and emerged? And what does it mean in terms of answering the research question? So this is where using reflective language comes in. The language that you use in synthesis should ideally reflect appropriate epistemic humility. And that is just basically another way of saying you report what you know, you report it faithfully. You obviously will think critically about it and say what it can or cannot tell you and what potential gaps might be exposed from the information that you have extracted and the themes that have emerged. But at the same time, and again, it bears repeating this constantly, you never overstep by saying something that the data cannot concretely, epistemologically or empirically actually support. In other words, don't claim or don't make claims that cannot be supported by all of the evidence that you have gathered so far, which sounds, again, on the surface very simple, but sometimes we unknowingly, in an effort to actually say something interesting, stretch ourselves a bit thin by making conclusions or drawing conclusions that can't actually be supported by the literature. So you're interpreting evidence, but you're not establishing absolute truth. And this is where reflective language comes in, because reflective language acknowledges uncertainty while still making meaningful claims. So the two are not at odds with each other, they're not contradictory. You can look at the data, you can look at the themes that have emerged, you can coalesce all of this into a meaningful, coherent body, which is what you should be doing in a synthesis. That is the purpose of a synthesis, drawing out all of these commonalities, these themes, looking at what can be said and what can not be said, and what the gaps are in the literature. But you're not going any further than that. You're not going to make claims that cannot be substantiated. That is essentially the bottom line. So at this stage, we prefer tentative language. By tentative language, we mean the evidence suggests that, fill in the blank. The pattern indicates, the findings appear to say or not say. This may reflect, one possible interpretation is, and the data point towards. So in all of these, you'll notice that the verbs that are actually employed suggest, indicate, appear, reflect, or the way that is actually framed, possible interpretation, point towards. All of this is very cautious language, and it's deliberately very cautious because, again, we don't want to overstep and potentially draw conclusions that cannot be substantiated by the data. So you're going to be avoiding claims such as the evidence proves. That's very definitive. Again, unless you're taking an extremely quantitative, reproducible form of analysis, which, to the best of my knowledge, isn't being covered here, it's very advisable to stay away from this type of language by saying that you conclusively can prove something. You also don't want to say, for example, that studies demonstrate conclusively. Again, what do you mean by conclusive? Can you actually stand up to any criticism that might come if they start challenging your methodology? It is certain that, what makes you so certain? Have you looked at all of the total body of knowledge that is out there? Have you looked at competing claims? Have you run this study by someone else or looked at similar studies that were done and trying to answer the same question? Are you sure that other researchers haven't come to a completely opposite conclusion from what you've come to, even though they use the same methodology? This definitively shows, again, the onus is on you to prove that. So tentative language isn't weakness. It is intellectual honesty. It is saying where the boundaries lie. It is showing where you can confidently say or not say something about your findings. And it acknowledges the constructed nature of synthesis while still advancing knowledge claims you can defend. So just to reiterate, you can and will basically be pulling together your body of knowledge, all of your themes that emerge. You will be integrating that into a whole. You will be interpreting that in your own light, and in light of your own background and your own approach, whatever that approach may be. But you simply don't step beyond that and make claims that cannot be backed up by the actual research itself or by the actual literature. So briefly, synthesis artifacts overview. So synthesis artifacts are visual or structured representations of your emerging interpretation. They serve both as analytical and communicative functions. So they help you to think through relationships and patterns, and they help readers to understand your synthesis. So you have narrative tables. So these are structured tables that organize findings thematically or conceptually. You might think of a simple Excel spreadsheet or something along those lines. And they often include study characteristics and quality ratings alongside findings. So this is where, again, a simple, maybe even a 2x2 table in some cases might come in very handy. Matrices, which is taking it a step further, so grid structures that map studies against themes or categories, making patterns of convergence and divergence immediately visible. What I would strongly suggest, because we don't have enough time for this today, what I would strongly suggest is go into the internet once this lesson is over, and if you want to know what examples of narrative tables, matrices, and these other forms or formats of displaying the data are, put it into Google, particularly put it into Google Images, and you will get very clear examples of what each of these look like. So matrices, as I said, are grid structures that map studies against themes or categories, and they make patterns of convergence and divergence immediately visible. Again, picture tells 1,000 words. Concept maps, I think we've all seen these, where you connect various different ideas together by strings or by arrows, ribbons, whatever you want to call them. The point is that you'll have different blurbs or boxes in a particular diagram, and they're all linked to one another, either in bidirectionally or unidirectionally. Again, you'll see more clear examples on the internet. And then finally, theoretical diagrams, which, as the name implies, are models that propose explanatory frameworks or causal pathways based on synthesized evidence. These represent higher order analytical outputs. In other words, one way of visualizing a theoretical diagram is think about a pyramid. Think about what is the most basic concept that you can actually extract from your data, what is the most basic underlying theme that emerges, and then try to work your way up into more concise or precise ideas or concepts that can be grounded or built upon that basic theme or image that emerges from your research. Again, not going to go in depth to that today because that's not the purpose of today's lesson, but more in-depth, more nuanced examples can definitely be found by just doing a very quick Google search. And in reality, you're likely to use multiple artifacts depending on the question that you're trying to answer, as well as what type of data you're working with. So it really will just depend, and you will mix and match as time goes along. So this then leads to developing a narrative synthesis table. And here we have a quick example. We have our study as one column or variable. We also have the design. We have a sample of what it might look like. We have key findings that are relevant or can be extracted. And then finally, we have the quality of it laid out. So here we have a paper by Jones from 2020. It was a qualitative interview. The N, or the sample size, was 15 adults with depression. The key findings were basically that participants emphasized importance of therapist flexibility in responding to fluctuating mood states. And then what is the quality of that? We can say in this particular case that it's high. Smith from 2019 conducted a mixed methods design or mixed methods study. The sample was basically 42 counseling clients. What was the key finding? Therapeutic alliance strengthened when therapists adapted approach based on client feedback. And the quality of that is medium. And then we may decide to look at the final paper, Chen from 2021, who used a randomized controlled trial, RCT. The sample was 120 anxiety patients. The key finding in that case was rigid protocol adherence associated with lower alliance scores compared to responsive adaptation. And we may come to the conclusion that it also is a very high quality. Note, just very quickly, in terms of research or the wider body of research, generally RCTs are considered the gold standard, although that's mainly for quantitative data. However, it can, in some instances, be transferred onto qualitative approaches that are used by therapists. Likewise, again, the structure of your methodology is going to have a huge impact on whether or not the study is considered, or the quality is considered high or low or medium. So you notice how the table enables you to see both individual contributions as well as emerging patterns. For example, all three studies suggest flexibility and adaptation matters. So when you develop a narrative synthesis table, it's again not just reporting findings or summarizing findings. It also should very quickly and easily allow you, as well as any casual reader, to be able to actually see what patterns are actually coming out from the literature. Now, if we're trying to look at a study from a theme matrix example, a study theme matrix provides an efficient overview of which studies contribute to which themes. And in this particular case, cells may or can contain check marks, quotes, or brief descriptive text. So what would that look like in practice? Again, we have an example, the paper Anderson from 2020. The theme or the empathic attunement could be the therapist really got me. Theme 2 that could emerge is collaborative goal setting. So we also put a check mark for that. We have another paper by Brong from 2019. It also meets the empathic attunement, and in this case, it also has information in terms of collaborative goal setting, so mutual agenda. And it furthermore has a third theme, which is rupture repair, and in the context of discuss tension openly. Another paper would be from Clark 2021. We see that it also checks off for the first theme and for the third theme as well in terms of repair of strengthened bond. And then finally, we have a fourth paper by Davis from 2018, which also checked off the first theme and under the label of feeling understood. It also checked off the second theme, and it did not meet the criteria for the third theme. So this format quickly shows which themes are well supported across studies and which appear more rarely, and it helps you to gauge confidence in different aspects of your synthesis. So in other words, if you notice certain themes appearing regularly across all papers, for example, theme 1 is the most strongly represented. You can see that the empathic attunement is basically met by all 4 of these papers. It's met sporadically by 3 out of 4 of the papers for the second theme, and then it's only met half of the time in terms of the third theme, which is rupture repair. So that would ideally give you some sort of idea in terms of how you would begin to structure your understanding of these various papers, what you would want to consider your main takeaway talking points, and what could be more contextual information. Speaking of which, if we are going to be laying this out in a conceptual diagram, we have an example here. So conceptual diagrams visually represent relationships between themes, processes, or mechanisms. They're particularly valuable for process-oriented or theory-building reviews. And a diagram might show, for example, temporal sequences, so what leads to what, hierarchical relationships, so broader constructs and subcomponents, reciprocal influences, for example, bidirectional arrows, moderating or mediating factors, variables that influence relationships, feedback loops, for example, cyclical processes. And when it's important to remember that when creating conceptual diagrams, you should ensure that each element is empirically grounded in the synthesized findings. In other words, if you are saying that element A is related to element B, or that theme 1 naturally gives rise to theme B, which naturally gives rise to theme 3, then you should be able to back that up by the information or by the data that is actually contained within the papers that you selected. Again, this should be very self-evident, but it just bears mentioning again. And again, just resist the temptation to add speculative components without evidentiary support, and clearly label which aspects represent interpretation versus which represent interpretations based on direct findings. So as long as all of this is very transparent, as long as you say exactly why you have come to the conclusions that you have come, or why you have decided to create or map the themes that you have mapped, and all of this, and your thought processes are very clear, you shouldn't encounter too much trouble or too much pushback in terms of criticism that you'll receive later on, in terms of analyzing your synthesis and your overall systematic review. So linking appraisal to confidence. Your quality appraisal work now becomes crucial for tempering claims or saying what you can or cannot say. Not all studies deserve equal weight in their synthesis, and your confidence in different findings should reflect their evidential bias or biases. Again, remember going back to an earlier conversation that we had when we said that there will come a point where you will have to decide based on the overarching research question that you're trying to ask whether some of the papers that you have held on to so far actually deserve to make it into your final synthesis, or whether they can be dropped, or whether you will keep them, but keep them as supporting material rather than keeping them as being the main body of your conclusions. And that is, again, just something that you'll have to determine empirically based on the data and based on what your research question is. So, what is one potential way of going about that? If we're looking at findings from high quality studies, so for example, these will warrant stronger language. For example, they would say things such as the evidence consistently demonstrates, or robust studies converge showing that, blah, blah, blah. If we're looking at findings from methodologically weaker studies, these might require more qualification. So preliminary evidence suggests that, or we may say something along the lines of findings from similar studies or smaller studies indicate blah, blah, blah. You notice that the language is becoming a lot more cautious because maybe the methodology is not quite as robust, the sample size was not as significant, and so therefore what can actually be said from these studies is very tentative and not very defensible. And then finally, contradictory findings, which will always occur at some point or the other. These demand exploration. So results, so we may say something like results are mixed with higher quality studies suggesting X, whilst earlier smaller studies have found Y. Again, this is just an artifact of how different studies are carried out, what their sample sizes were, what their methodology was, whether or not there was an overarching framework to the methodology that was used, whether or not a theme was already generated and applied, or whether or not it was developed coherently or organically. All of these are things to take into consideration to make you, or that would assist you in determining whether or not findings would be classified as high quality or weaker quality in terms of answering your research question. One useful tool is the study called the Mixed Methods Appraisal Tool, MMAT, which provides a structured way to integrate quality assessment into your synthesis and helps you to weight studies appropriately. This can be found easily on the internet. And finally, just want to say that lower quality studies may still contribute insight, but would reduce interpretive weight. So again, it's not about just chucking something out the minute you feel that the sample size was too small or the methodology wasn't as robust as some other study. It's more about thinking critically and saying there are aspects of a particular paper that will help me to inform my final decision and help me to form my final conceptual clarity, but I don't necessarily need it in terms of interpreting the wider body of information that I'm working with. So again, just to continue harping on a theme that has been appearing throughout this presentation, transparency reporting standards. It's important to note that synthesis quality depends not just on what you do, but on how clearly you report it. You can have all the rich data in the world and have very clearly, highly developed concepts and ideas, but if you cannot express that very clearly to your readers, you will not be achieving your objective of basically providing insight. So readers need to understand and evaluate your interpretive choices. This is where the NTREC guidelines come in. NTREC basically standing for Enhanced Transparency in Reporting the Synthesis of Qualitative Research, and it provides a useful framework for how to do this. So this involves documenting your process, explain your coding approach, how themes were developed, who was involved in the synthesis, and how disagreements were resolved. Show examples of including illustrative quotations from studies, show, for example, how codes lead to themes, and provide sample entries from your synthesis table. And finally, acknowledge limitations, being clear about what your synthesis can and cannot claim, which populations or contexts are underrepresented, and where uncertainty remains, despite all the data or lack of data that you may have. Transparency does not mean that you expose every minor decision. That would be too tedious and too time consuming for both you and the reader, but it does mean that the reader should be able to follow your analytical journey and assess the trustworthiness of your conclusions. In other words, said in plain English, if I can see how you went from conceptualizing your study to actually gathering the data, to actually extracting that data, and what methods and mechanisms you actually use to form your themes, to form your overarching concepts and your final conclusions, as long as that is very transparent, people may disagree with you, but they cannot fundamentally argue if you have a sound methodology of how you actually did that, how you laid it out. So here we have a quick practice task of creating your artifact. This is basically just individual work using the findings you've grouped in an earlier activity, the one that we did earlier, or preliminary findings from your own review if it's available. Create one synthesis artifact and choose the format that best suits your data and analytical needs. So the first option is a narrative table, which we've discussed before, the second one being a theme matrix, and the third being a concept map. So this would ideally take 15 minutes, but if I'm not mistaken, Joe, we won't be stopping to doing that right now. This is just
we don't have time, but is
Yeah.
this something which we encourage you to have a go at some point between now and whenever?
Yeah, so you can obviously do this on your own timing, and it's a fun activity in the sense that basically you'll get to understand what artifacts work and which don't, depending on your particular question. So again, just to summarize very quickly, reflexivity in synthesis is the practice of examining how your own positions, assumptions, and theoretical commitments shape the synthesis process and outcomes. And in level 7 work, reflexivity isn't optional, it is the hallmark of scholarly maturity. Being able to understand why you came to the conclusions that you've come and showing very clearly and transparently why you have chosen to take the approach you have taken. Your theoretical orientation, so your psychodynamics, CBT, personal centers, whatever, influence what you notice, how you interpret, and what you emphasize. Your professional experience, your cultural background, and your personal history with the topic all shape your analytical lens. And reflexivity basically means that these, or making these influences visible, should be your priority rather than pretending to be objective. One key reference is McLeod, Quality Research in Counseling and Psychotherapy, second edition. Again, this can be found online, and you will be looking at chapter 10, which addresses reflexivity in synthesis and secondary analysis. We have another reflexivity in practice. So what would this actually look like? We have a quotation here from Schoen, 1983. The researcher does not stand outside the swamp of practice as an objective observer, but steps into the swamp to engage with the phenomena directly. In other words, you're not apart from your data or your research. You are shaping the research actively. Sorry. So this metaphor applies beautifully to the synthesis work. You are not a neutral processor or an objective bystander, as it were, of information, but you're actively interpreting whose choices matter. As somebody said earlier in one of our discussions, you as a researcher have a very powerful role to play in terms of deciding what data is kept and what is left out, and how that actually frames the final analysis or the final interpretation. And so you have to step into the swamp, which means that you acknowledge your involvement, whilst at the same time maintaining your analytical rigor. So it's a very tight rope to walk, but it's one that actually pays off in the long run. So consider keeping a reflective journal throughout the synthesis process. After coding sessions or when developing themes, pause to read it. Ask yourself, for example, what am I drawn to in this data? What am I perhaps overlooking? How might my training or experience be shaping what I see? And then these notes become invaluable when writing your synthesis and discussion sections. Some common pitfalls to avoid. So learning from common mistakes, you have synthesis pitfalls, which include listing studies sequentially. So don't just go around saying Smith found X, Jones found Y, Chen found Z. This is just summary information. This is, again, the complete opposite of what we're looking for at this stage. You're not just secretaries. You're not just necessarily just collating the data and then just representing it in a table format. Again, any software can do that nowadays. You are taking the step of being going further and synthesizing all of this, and so you have to actually integrate it across studies analytically. Also, as we've said perhaps 1,000 times before, don't overclaim from limited evidence. So 2 small qualitative studies don't warrant claims like clients universally experience blah, blah, blah. Calibrate your claims to evidence strength. So if you have more evidence, you can make slightly stronger but still tentative claims. If you have weaker evidence, you might be more cautious in your language. Ignoring weak or contradictory evidence, don't just cherry pick which studies you want that support your preferred interpretation and dismiss information that doesn't. And then finally, absence of reflexivity, which is basically presenting synthesis as if you're a neutral conduit rather than an active interpreter. You are the one who obviously at the end of the day is the final arbiter of what gets included and what doesn't get included. And as long as you own up to that and explain what your lens is, then you become much more respected as a researcher because you are owning your actual interpretation and biases rather than just pretending that you don't have any. So a final reflection, take a moment to reflect on today's session, consider what has shifted in your understanding of synthesis work. Here's a prompt. So for example, what has shifted for you about synthesis today? What felt clear? What remains challenging? Share your reflections with a partner or write them in your learning journal and articulate what you've learned and how it helps to consolidate your understanding. Synthesis is challenging precisely because it requires both analytical rigor and interpretive creativity. So it's straddling the fine line between following a very clear and precise methodology, but also letting your imagination tell you what the data could potentially be saying. And you're also learning to think like a knowledge constructor, not just an information manager. That is very difficult, and the work that actually makes a systematic review very scholarly in the end. So
you can skip these next two, Antonio, because they've got the
Yeah.
slides. They can go back over that.
Yeah, so we'll just go over these, quickly skip over these, and yeah, so the next section will basically be looking at group findings, provisional tables, one synthesis artifact, and reflective notes. And yeah, that is essentially the end of the lesson part of today's class. I believe Joe wants us to stick around for a while to have some discussions.
Thank you, Antonio. Yeah, so I just want to just thank you, Antonio. I mean, you've given us so much information today. I hope that everybody, this has brought synthesis, certainly for me, to life. So I've really enjoyed the presentation. So thank you so much for your knowledge and your expertise. Just as a show of hands, is anybody planning on coming to the clinic after today's session? No. Okay. I will cancel that clinic. That's fine. So rather than spending 10 minutes having a checkout, I wonder, because Antonio is here, whether you have any questions lingering from anything that's been brought to the session today.
I was just wondering, but that was a lot of information. Anyway, I think I've got a bit of information overload.